David Cay Johnston. Hi, David.
Hello, Mark.
David, this racketeering charge, I guess this is the stuff that they do go after mobsters with typically. And I wonder if you can speak to the specifics here and why it might be an effective way to go after Donald Trump and his minions.
Well, Donald Trump's a white-collar mobster and always has been. RICO statutes were originally the idea of Robert Blakey, a Notre Dame University law professor and former federal prosecutor whom I know well. And the idea was, what do you do when you have what appears to be a business, but it's really a criminal enterprise? That was what he approached. And that's how he went after mob folks. Now, the Georgia RICO statute provides that the enterprise doesn't have to be a business. The enterprise can be overthrowing the government or overturning the results of the Georgia election. And there are lots of specific details in this indictment. The law requires only showing two predicate acts, that is, two acts to further the RICO operation, and there's a whole bunch of them in this indictment, which to Donald I think is a very dangerous indictment, because if he or someone friendly to him gets back to the White House and he is convicted, they can't pardon him out of this. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, has no power to pardon, although two things may happen, Mark. The Republicans could give Governor Kemp the power to pardon, specifically to help Donald. And
how would that happen, David?
Oh, they just pass a law that grants the governor pardon authority.
You're saying the legislature in Georgia would do that? That's
correct.
Okay, just to be clear.
Legislature in Georgia, which is controlled by Republicans, and Brian Kemp is a Republican. I don't think Kemp would welcome a law like that, based on the fact that he's tried to separate himself from Donald. Secondly, effective October 1st, there's a law that would allow the removal of prosecutors in Georgia for any reason, as we've seen Ron DeSantis do with prosecutors in Florida. Fani Willis is an elected prosecutor. She was chosen by the people of her jurisdiction. Now, it's not as simple as the law takes effect and they can remove her. There's supposed to be the appointment of a committee. Members haven't been appointed yet. The governor and others have to appoint them. But between now and when proceedings with Trump would be wound up, there's enough time for them to remove her. And the Republicans may well do that. I mean, they are desperate in many places to protect Donald Trump from accountability for his own conduct.
Yeah, it's funny. I mentioned that second scenario last hour. But boy, when you say that Republicans may do that, it scares me. But this is sort of the 0 hour. They kind of have to do whatever, it's break the glass, pull the lever time, right?
Right. Well, yes, unless, you're willing to say that you actually believe in the things that Republicans have been saying for years. They believe in accountability. They believe in a law and order. It's very bizarre that the people who say, if I get to Washington, I'm going to defund the FBI, I'm going to tear the Justice Department apart. Those are all Republicans. Now, there have been a few fringe Democrats like Maxine Waters,
Maxine Waters,
LA congressman who I knew a little when I was at the LA Times, who have made some, rather outrageous sort of statements, but they're not part of the leadership. They're in the fringe.
There are a lot of people who have an axe to grind with the Justice Department when it swings around to them, and sometimes those axes are, legit grinders. But I think you're right. The irony is so incredibly loud when it comes to the GOP. The other thing I saw, just speaking of stuff that's just bizarro, I saw Lindsey Graham, doing his Lindsey Graham dance on Fox News or one of these right-wing outlets, in which he was saying, this should be settled at the ballot box. This isn't something that should be settled in a courtroom. That's why we have elections. I'm thinking, dude, that's why we're in the courtroom, because you guys overthrew the last election or tried to. I mean, it's like, it's so rich.
And Lindsey Graham, who is a former military officer, he was in the Judge Advocate Corps, is a lawyer. He knows better than this. Grand juries are composed of ordinary citizens. They're presented with evidence. Clearly, a great deal of time was put in by this grand jury and by the earlier investigative grand jury. A lot of witnesses testified. And the assertion that this is just nonsense made up out of nowhere that Trump and a number of his allies are making is ridiculous. But if Donald is absolutely innocent, as he intends, he contends, he says, I've done absolutely nothing wrong, everything is perfect. Well, he should be eager to go to trial. He should be, hey, I want to get in the courtroom right now because we're going to show that they don't have a case. And he knows perfectly well they have an incredibly strong case. That's why he wants to delay, but more importantly, if he can, stop or vitiate through something like a pardon power, any effort to hold him accountable.
Vitiate's a ding word. I want to show the post that actually speaks to what David's talking about from Donald Trump on Truth Social. Tony, you have that up? This is a large, complex, detailed, but irrefutable report on the presidential election fraud, which took place in Georgia, is almost complete and will be presented by me at a major news conference at 11 a.m. on Monday of next week in Bedminster, New Jersey. It's a short commute for him then. Based on the results of this conclusive report, conclusives in capital letters, David, all charges should be dropped against me and others. There will be a complete exoneration in capital letters. They never went after those that rigged the election. They only went after those that fought to find the riggers. Now, as we were saying, David, he's always about, next week I'm going to come through with my health care plan. You're not going to believe how great it is.
Infrastructure week.
Infrastructure plan, right. And now this large, complex, detailed report on election fraud.
Right. I tweeted about this earlier today. I'm not holding my breath. And of course, what Donald thinks is an exoneration is the kind of nonsense that, you'll hear from people like Tucker Carlson and the folks at Breitbart who just make things up, or when it's possible, pretzel the facts. But, we'll see. If he's got it on Monday, then let's see what it is. But, having 35 plus years of history with Donald.
Exactly. So I guess he's got, who's writing that? Maybe if he can get Bannon on the phone, he would probably put together the rogues gallery of those who might write something.
Donald certainly will not be writing it.
I know it's early, but can you handicap what's going to happen and the timing? And what I really feel I wanted you on, not just for the legal side, but because the political side is such a big part of this, I wanted you to speak to that as well.
Well, I don't think Donald is doing as well as some of the polls suggest. His crowds have been shriveling, and at DC Report, we sent journalists to several of three, I guess, of his rallies, 3 or 4, and showed that the rallies crowds in 2020 had diminished significantly. His most recent rallies, there have been lots and lots of empty seats. Trump makes sure that the TV cameras are only allowed to shoot in a certain direction. So you have to be clever about how to get pictures in the back of the room. And we came up with a technique for doing that to show there are all these empty seats everywhere. His fundraising gets a surge every time he's indicted, but it's not overall growing left and right. And I think a lot of the support you're hearing for Trump is very soft. And as more and more evidence comes out, you're never going to get the true blue Trumpers who believe that he is God incarnate or something close to it, sent to save us. But people who have an actual brain in their head and some critical thinking skills are going to more and more separate themselves from Trump. And particularly with the issue of, do I want a president whose presidency is all about his grievances personally? Or do I want to get the country going in a direction, which could be a different direction than where we're going? But, Donald didn't put us in any new direction when he was there, except for things that he did not say he was going to do. $28 billion of welfare for farmers in the Midwest, who would have been better off if he hadn't engaged in his absolutely mindless tariff policies, borrowing money, 2.5, actually closer to 3 trillion now, over the next 10 years to give the richest people in America and the biggest corporations tax cuts. Not you and me, we got crumbs. But to provide them to people who have absolutely no need for more revenue. And by borrowing money. So I think that we will see over time Donald's position will weaken. What the Republicans haven't managed to do is come up with a credible alternative to him. It's certainly not going to be Will Hurd or Nikki Haley, if for no other reason than many Republicans want to make America white again. That's part of the reason Trump appeals to them.
So Vivek Ramaswamy, who has risen in the polls, he's like, I think he's Trump plus, actually. I mean, he's really, he wants to send troops to the southern border and all this kind of thing. He says all that stuff and he speaks so well. And he says, I'm data driven, fact driven, and then he just blows smoke. You think that his race may keep him out of the GOP?
Absolutely. I mean, he'll get some numbers that are in support for him because of the things he's saying. But, Will Hurd, the former Texas congressman who's been calling out Trump and is a Republican, he's black. Nikki Haley's parents came from India. The other gentleman whose last name I sadly haven't learned how to pronounce.
Yeah, Vivek. Just say Vivek. You're Ramaswamy, yeah.
Yeah, he's from the Indian subcontinent historically.
And Tim Scott, too,
Yeah, and Tim Scott is black. I mean, the Republicans have a real fundamental problem, and that is the demographics of the country have changed. This is not 1950s America. This is not before the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement. And they just haven't adapted to that. And, one of my best friends, a guy I have lunch with every month, always says to me when this comes up, he goes, they can't change. It's who they are. And if they can't change, then they're destined to be a minority party. And that's not a good prospect going forward. You really don't want to live in a country where one party is dominant all over the place. You want to have a competition of ideas. And having that competition of ideas forces both parties to be more rigorous in what they do. I mean, one of the things I've written about is that shown arguments made by Republicans that don't have any heft to them, and how that's allowed Democrats to push things that are, I think, flabby and not well thought through, and would be much better if they had to rigorously debate these things.
That's such a good point. And sadly, I feel like we've drifted from that. I mean, we're farther away from that now than we might have been, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. We don't debate policy. In fact, even this Trump thing isn't about policy. I mean, they throw... that's why I was talking before about the immigration problem. It just is now used as a prop almost. Neither party is really going to see it through to some kind of feasible strategy of conclusion.
Yeah, the really sad thing you can show with the Republicans in terms of policy is that 33 U.S. senators, including Ted Cruz, signed a letter saying, please give special prosecutor status to David Weiss, the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Delaware, so that his jurisdiction to examine crimes by Hunter Biden is not limited to crimes committed in Delaware, but to crimes he may have committed in California and other jurisdictions. And then they got it. And what was their response? You've seen them all on TV. Oh, this is part of the cover-up. It's part of the Biden crime family cover-up. You got to have some consistency to what you're doing. Now, I've taken the position all the way along. If Joe Biden is in fact been on the take, let's see the evidence and let's pursue him. The Republicans haven't come up with anything. One of their witnesses, the guy who disappeared on them, turns out to be a Chinese agent. And the second guy, the one who testified behind closed doors, and almost none of the committee members came to that meeting. What does the transcript show? Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, they had 5 years with the same guy, and you're so right. They asked for that specific guy, and now they're talking about the fact that guy is a puppet. He's weak. It's so.
And this goes back in time, Mark. I mean, Benghazi. Bring up Benghazi, and then you ask people who will cite that. Well, what exactly happened there? They don't have a clue. You ask them, well, how would the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, tell the military not to send jet fighters? And by the way, how would a jet fighter plane help a man inside a burning building surrounded by a mob? Jet fighters can't suddenly stop like a helicopter and pick you up. And by the way, there was U.S. military in another part of the country who wanted to come to the rescue, and the Libyans prevented them from doing so. It had nothing to do with the rioters in Benghazi. It had to do with, it's our sovereign territory. You don't have any right to be here. The Republicans have learned that if they can get some word or phrase associated with bad, there's a huge part of the public that will parrot that. And the people who will do that are either not interested in the facts or they don't have the critical skills to do so. And to that, one last point, I think it's incredibly important to understand what's gone wrong with our politics, that 54% of Americans read at the level of a sixth grader, a 12-year-old or below, and 1 in 5 at the level of an 8-year-old, a third grader or below. And I don't care how smart you were, when you're 12 years old, you don't have critical thinking skills. And if you can't read at the level of a college student or at least a high school graduate, you can't critically understand issues that aren't really simple.
No, and that's why the dumbing down of everything is so effective. This is a little off point, but I wondered if you can maybe, in our last few minutes here, James Watson said, would love to hear how David Cay Johnston sees our politics going when AI is fully deployed and the truth is very hard for anyone to discern.
James, I think this is an enormous problem that we haven't begun to grapple with. I've been thinking a lot about what's going to happen with my law students at Syracuse University who have to write a paper. It's half their grade. I'm trying to think of strategies to make sure that they actually did the papers and they didn't use artificial intelligence. There are, in the early days of this, some signs that you can see. For example, there's a photo that's been all over the internet supposedly showing Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump on a sofa surrounded by a bunch of what look to be teen girls. But if you look at it closely, you'll notice Epstein has no legs. It's a fabrication. But, when we had chemical film, it was pretty easy to tell if a photo was doctored. With digital film, it's much harder. It's possible to do it, but much harder. Now that we have this artificial intelligence, it's very concerning. And remember, the artificial intelligence texts depend on large language models. That is, they scoop up things that are written all over the place. And so there's no creativity in that. There's no new thoughts and insights. It's only bringing back to you in a new format things that are already out there. Well, that's not how human beings advance. I mean, if that was the case, let's go back and stick to the text from Athens, Attica, to those who study this, from 2,500 years ago.
Yeah, it's so true. By the way, I think there are now, like some kind of spy versus spy, ways to figure out if something is largely AI generated. I'm sure as a professor will look into that, but
there'll be tools to try and uncover this stuff.
Yeah,
there are tools now to look for plagiarism, but none of them are perfect. But the danger to me, in my mind, is in the case of students. If you're paying, as my students are, $72,000 a year in tuition, I mean, you get discounts and all that, but that's the posted price for an education. If you're having artificial intelligence write your paper, what a waste. You're not learning anything. And the object of a college education is not to learn specific facts unless you're in certain fields where that matters, engineering, for example. It is to show that you can absorb a large amount of material from many disciplines, undertake a very complex multi-year project and successfully complete it. And if you're not doing the work, you're not getting the benefit from it.
Yeah,
it's not the paper that matters, it's the education you get.
Sure. Of course, that's so true. It's a real challenge for academics, but it's a challenge, as James said, for politics, and what's real and what's not. And you're right. This frontier is something that we're just beginning to understand, and it is way ahead of our ability to regulate it or even really understand it.
Regulation, I teach my students, always has to follow experience. Nobody would have imagined aviation law and air traffic control 500 years ago. Somebody had to figure out how to turn bauxite rocks into aluminum tubes and ancient ferns into jet fuel to send us flying through the sky before anybody thought of aviation law. So we're going to have to go through a period where there'll be lots of disasters, problems, conflicts, mistakes, careers ruined, careers get promoted ahead until we have enough experience for the law to catch up with that. The law always follows.
So we're so far behind. I'll just ask you this very quickly. You mentioned the law. Handicap this latest thing for us. I mean, 19 indictments. It's a massive case. RICO, you've explained that part. But how do you handicap it, though? What's going to happen? What's the timeline, short term, long term?
So long as the judge is not removed from the case, then I think Trump is highly likely to be convicted in this case. He also is highly likely to end up risking being remanded, that is, held in custody, because Georgia has a law that's very tough on bail. I mean, it's a racist law on its face, but it may turn out to be damaging to Donald. I also expect that a number of the 18 Confederates are going with their lawyers to go in and try to turn state's evidence, a phrase, by the way, I don't hear in the news anymore, but to, cooperate with the prosecution. Some of them are going to be told, sorry, you should have come in earlier. We don't need you anymore. But there no doubt are some people who could be incredibly valuable. And the number one person would be Mark Meadows, who you'll notice wasn't named an unindicted co-conspirator in the federal January 6th case, indicating he probably has been cooperating with prosecutors. And I'd say that he'd be probably the first person to come in and try to make an offer of here's what I would testify to get himself out from under that case.
That would be huge, really huge. Yeah. I mean, all right. Well, we'll check in with you again next week, David. So kind. Really enjoy our time together. David Cay Johnston, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.